Is the president concerned about democracy or defeat? I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. All right, imagine it's election night, November 3rd, 2020. You're tuned into CNN, and it's very late, maybe even into the next morning. Wolf Blitzer has just called another state, tosses to John King in front of his magic wall. King, with that encyclopedic command of the electoral map, gives the very latest breakdown, which shows that President Trump has a slight lead based on votes cast in person. King then throws it back to Anderson Cooper, who has an announcement that the race is too close to call and will remain so for days due to the unprecedented receipt of mail-in or absentee ballots in several swing states, including Michigan and Pennsylvania. And then a week later, when all the votes have been counted, Trump's lead has vanished and Joe Biden is declared the winner. Here's my question. Would that outcome be accepted by partisans who'd been conditioned for months to equate mail-in voting with voter fraud? After all, just this past week, President Trump threatened to withhold aid from Michigan and Nevada because of alleged illegal activity related to absentee ballots. And on Thursday night, he was quick to assert, quote, fraud, while embracing a Laura Ingraham tweet that compared grocery shopping to voting. In March, the president said that efforts to expand voting would guarantee, quote, you'd never have a Republican elected again. But his antipathy is not data-driven. 5 states currently vote entirely by mail, and studies of those states don't show either party benefiting. Writing for 538 blog, Lee Drutman recently noted, in a recent study, a team of Stanford University political scientists looked at county-level implementation of vote by mail in California, Utah, and Washington. They found no statistically significant partisan difference between counties that had transitioned to voting fully by mail and those that had not, along with a slight increase in voter turnout. Another research team recently analyzed the effects of voting by mail in Colorado, and although they found a much higher effect on overall voter turnout than previous studies, they also had a similar null partisan finding. More voters turned out to support Democratic candidates, but more voters also turned out to support Republican candidates. So why is President Trump so against postal ballots? Is it a concern for democracy or a concern over his defeat? My next guest convened a conference and ad hoc committee of legal scholars to study concerns about the fairness and legitimacy of the coming election and to make recommendations to protect the sanctity of the vote. Those recommendations included that, quote, states should adopt reforms to improve the absentee ballot and provisional ballot processes, both in terms of access and security. Plus, there were recommendations for the media, such as this one. It's especially important for the media to convey to the public the idea that given an expected increase in absentee ballot voting in the November 2020 elections, delays in election reporting are to be expected, not evidence of fraud, and that the 2020 presidential election may be too early to call until days after the election. Richard Hasen is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California at Irvine. He's the author of Election Meltdown: Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy. Okay, Professor, you know this subject area well. We have 5 states that are entirely by mail. What is the record of fraud in those states?
The record of fraud in those states is quite low, and overall in the United States, the record is that election fraud is rare. It does occasionally happen with absentee ballots, but if you look at the scale of voting by mail, it's very, very small.
What about the shenanigans I keep hearing bantied about that took place in North Carolina's 9th Congressional District?
Right. So even though it's rare, it's not non-existent. What happened in 2018 is that an operative working for a Republican congressional candidate allegedly went around, collected absentee ballots against North Carolina law, and either tampered with them by changing votes or destroyed some ballots. It was so bad that the bipartisan North Carolina State Board of Elections decided they needed to redo the election. I think the point is that the fraud was caught. It's very hard to have a conspiracy like this and not get caught. And as long as there are safeguards like prosecuting someone who engages in this kind of activity, I think it's a risk worth taking. given the kind of disenfranchisement we could face if people can't safely go to the polling places in November.
Here's another critique that I hear, and as a matter of fact, this one made the Wall Street Journal's editorial page today. The subject is ballot harvesting. The Journal wrote in part, as states extend mail voting, they should tighten deadlines and ban ballot harvesting. The push for all mail voting is relentlessly focused on ballot access, which is important, but ensuring ballot integrity is crucial for public confidence in election outcomes and ultimately for democratic legitimacy. Do they have a point?
I think they do have a point, but what's ironic about that editorial is that they point out that voters of color are more likely to have their ballots rejected because of finding some kind of technical flaw in how the ballot is cast. And so we really need to work on that, including making sure that voters can cure their ballots if they're tossed, for example, because of a purported signature mismatch. But I think reasonable limits on the number of ballots that can be collected is a smart thing. There has been no proof of fraud, even though California has unlimited collection of absentee ballots by third parties. And despite what some Republicans are saying, there's no proof of any fraud whatsoever related to the 2018 elections. That's where, as the vote count continued, we saw the numbers go from a Republican lead to a Democratic lead. But I do think that the Journal is right that when you have so many people out there collecting ballots, it does raise questions about voter confidence, especially in this polarized atmosphere. And putting reasonable limits like Colorado has, where you can collect up to 10 absentee ballots from others, seems like a smart compromise.
How concerned are you about the scenario that I laid out in my opening commentary?
I'm very concerned. I think that it's certainly possible in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, which didn't have no-fault absentee balloting before. It's quite possible that President Trump could be ahead in the count on election night, but as millions of additional ballots are counted over the next few days, the lead could shift to Biden. And Trump, who's been making unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud for years, has now started shifting to making these claims about mail-in balloting, and he could certainly claim that there is something wrong with how the vote count was done. It's going to be very important to stick with the facts and very important for the media to educate the public that just because it's going to take time to count the votes, that doesn't mean something nefarious is going on behind the scenes. In fact, that should be a good sign that election workers are acting carefully to make sure that the results are accurate and fair.
It's very hard to get into his head and know what his rationale might be in making the claims that he's making about mail-in voting. But here's a question that I think we can answer with science and with data. Is he making an argument against his own interest? In other words, is it so clear that a Republican candidate, that he would be the loser for a system that relies more on postal ballots?
Oh, I think absolutely he's shooting himself in his own foot, because Republicans are, if we have the pandemic raging in the fall, Republicans are going to have to depend on vote by mail. And in lots of places, the Republican Party has engaged in extensive vote by mail efforts. They're now trying to thread a thin needle saying, don't vote by absentee, but vote by mail if you need to. Some kind of strange way of trying to distinguish what the president is saying. As a point of fact, if Republican voters don't want to be disenfranchised, they need to vote by mail in places where it's not safe to go to the polling place. And we saw in the April 7th Wisconsin primary that Republicans, because they were not getting assistance from the Republican Party, had more trouble navigating the system to sign up to get an absentee ballot and voted in lower numbers than Democrats, letting Democrats elect their preferred choice for the state Supreme Court. I think Republicans really need to turn this around and ensure that their voters, too, are not disenfranchised and have reasonable ways to be able to cast a ballot in November.
I'm going to do my part with the multiple platforms that I have access to, as you've recommended, to educate the public that it's possible we might not have a victor on election night, and that doesn't mean, by definition, that something nefarious is taking place.